Welcome everybody, Shiur number 614. We're learning today Le'iloi Nishmas Moshe Dov Ben Rabban Zis Le'iloi Nishmas Blima Basra Moshe. Okay, getting back to our malacha of DOSH, Mefarek squeezing material. So I just want to talk today a little bit about the inyan of the toothbrush. What are some of the problems, and is there any way that one could use a toothbrush on Shabbos? So, Lamaisa, there are a number of poskim who talk about the inyan of toothbrush on Shabbos. Reb Moshe has a very famous tshuva. It's a very short tshuva, a few lines, just to go through it real quickly, and then we'll see some other ins and outs in reference to a toothbrush. So, as far as toothpaste goes, the paste itself, says Reb Moshe, in Orach Chaim, it's in Orach Chaim Chelek Aleph, Siman Kuf Yud Beis. Tells us Rab Moshe, number one, as far as toothpaste goes, you have a problem of memachek. That is the schmearing. There's one of the lamates malachas of memachek, memareach, which we're going to talk about Bezras Hashem, and that's the malacha of schmearing. So that is the problem with the toothpaste. So to use regular Shabbos toothpaste, that cannot be done, number one. Number two, says Rab Moshe, that even if you're going to say that it's a toothbrush, you're going to use a toothbrush without the toothpaste per se, just regular toothbrush, and just going to brush out some of the dirt from the teeth. So says Rab Moshe that vesabrush toiv shaloi lelachlech b'mayim koidem anikum echashash schitas b'seir. In other words, what if the worst case scenario? In other words, a person should use dry. If anything, just to use dry, but not to wet the toothbrush before doing so, because you're running into a problem of schitas seir, which we've been talking about, and that is when wetting a regular toothbrush and then you put pressure on the toothbrush, the water is trapped in between the bristles. And now by putting pressure, one is squeezing it out the same way whereby one, if they put pressure on their hair, when they squeeze out their hair, they start pressing down on their hair. It's also schitas seir. They are pressing and squeezing out the hair. The same way, squeezing out a wet toothbrush is the same inyan. It's aser midrabanan as far as the squeezing part. Now, another thing Rab Moshe says also, even if you're going to say, good, we're not using toothpaste. Now you're going to say also, we're not going to wet the toothbrush. Says Rab Moshe, it should be meyuchad for Shabbos. In other words, v'loi toothpaste, he says, ba'brush ha-meyuchad lazeh, a toothbrush that is set aside for a Shabbos toothbrush. In other words, this is my Shabbos toothbrush. Then he says Rab Moshe, it will be mutter shu kamoi rechitzas shar ever echad ella yishtoif rak betzainin. But make sure if you're one rinses out their mouth after they use the dry toothbrush that's meyuchad for Shabbos, to make sure rinsing out your mouth using only cold water. Of course, we don't use hot water on Shabbos. Now, another interesting thing Rab Moshe says at the end, that this is all in mamish a few lines, the whole tshuva, he brings all these different klolim in reference to a regular toothbrush on Shabbos. Says Rab Moshe that even after the toothbrush is dry, and it's a toothbrush that's set aside specifically for Shabbos, and I did not use any toothpaste. But even after all that, make sure after you clean your teeth with the dry toothbrush, not to start rinsing off the toothbrush, because of the fact that one is not going to use it anymore for today, for Shabbos, and it should not be washed off for tomorrow, which will be hachana l'chol, preparing for a weekday. Okay, so now the Sefer Klolim goes through basically the same thing, and he adds actually one more condition. He says also to make sure that this toothbrush, shahayu hasares rakas, it should be very soft. Kadesh lo yaver mishum asiyas chabures haitzoas dam. In other words, one should be careful whereby they shouldn't come to bleed, even if they're going to use the toothbrush in those 5 conditions. That we'll go through them again real quickly. But even if they're going to use such a toothbrush dry, without washing, without good after I clean my teeth, I'm not going to wash it off. I'll just put it down on the side because it's preparing for during the week. But also to make sure that the toothbrush is very soft, whereby one will not come to make his gums bleed. one has to know in general if they have problems with gums whereby it bleeds when they start brushing their teeth, then for sure they cannot use these various different types of toothbrushes, even though you have all the 5 conditions, which we'll go through one more time. I just wanted to mention also in reference to flossing would be the same thing. Using a pre-cut floss on Shabbos is okay. Or sometimes they have, many times people have flosses that are already set. They have these little flosses that it's a quick throwaway type of a floss. You use it, then you throw it away during the week. Or sometimes the floss you have to cut. So let's say on Shabbos, from Erev Shabbos Friday, one pre-cut their floss, or they're using this throwaway floss. So the same thing. If you are allowed to floss on Shabbos, but one has to make sure, again, 2 things. Number 1, the floss is cut from before Shabbos, and number 2, is that one will not be bleeding when they use the floss. Now, if one knows that during the week, most of the time they don't bleed, my gums, Baruch Hashem, don't bleed. And if it happens to be they did it once and it bled, okay, that's not the problem. The problem is when it's secretion, when it's going to happen. They floss their teeth, and a good chunk of the time, their teeth bleed when they floss during the week. So then sometimes the teeth are more sensitive, the gums are more sensitive, or whatever it is, then one must refrain from flossing on Shabbos. So the same thing with the toothbrush, even with these conditions, if they know when they brush their teeth, sometimes they have a little bit of bleeding, a little bit of sensitive gums or the like, then that will be another problem with using a regular toothbrush on Shabbos. So, Lemaisa, to make a long story short, just real quickly to go through the 5 conditions again. So, it does the Sefer Klalim. He brings it down from the Minchas Yitzchak, from the Igris Moshe, like we just mentioned, that the 5 conditions in reference to using, if somebody actually does want to use a toothbrush on Shabbos. Number 1, we said, of course, one cannot use regular toothpaste. That is memachek, smearing, number 1. Number 2, he says to make sure the toothbrush is soft enough whereby one will not bleed on Shabbos. Number 2. Number 3, that he brings another condition, actually, whereby the toothbrush, one has to make sure that it's not whereby the bristles will be coming out. In other words, sometimes the person brushes their teeth and it's not a good quality toothbrush. Sometimes the bristles start coming out. That is also running into a problem of soiser on Shabbos, stiras kli, which would also be a problem. And then he says, number 4, like we mentioned in the Igris Moshe, that it has to be miyachid sheteheya mavreshes miyuchad l'Shabbos. It has to be miyachid for Shabbos, specific toothbrush for Shabbos. And the last condition, which also we mentioned, that one has to be careful that one should not rinse it off afterwards, kadesh lo yava mishum machana l'chol, because of the fact that they're preparing for the week. Okay, so I just do want to mention, I'm not so familiar with it, but I have heard in the past they do have something called a Shabbos toothbrush, and basically it's supposed to be set up whereby the bristles are made in a thicker form, maybe spread out a little bit further apart. Plastic whereby the water, number 1, does not get trapped in between like a regular toothbrush, and you won't have the problem of schita cyrus, number 1. Number 2, one cannot use, of course, regular toothpaste, which is mimareach. They might have a liquid toothpaste possibly, but regular toothpaste cannot be used either way. But the bristles are more like rounded out, and it's more plastic, and whereby, again, it's not getting trapped in between. It's specifically made for Shabbos, obviously, because it's a Shabbos toothbrush. It's not something people use during the week. You don't have that issue. The issue of rinsing it off for the weekday also should not be done. Also, it would have to be, like we mentioned, soft enough to whereby the person knows where even if they do use a so-called Shabbos toothbrush, they won't come to make their teeth bleed, and it won't fall apart. Like we said, the question of stiras kli, and so on, using all the 5 conditions like we went through in this year. If that's the type of toothbrush it is, then fine. Then then b'chol hakavod, as they say, it would be allowed to be used without the toothpaste and so on. Like we said, sometimes there is liquid toothpaste or the like. So to make a long story short, there's quite a number of conditions that have to be met in using a regular toothbrush. So the best thing is not to use it in general on Shabbos, and in reference again to this Shabbos toothbrush, as long as it meets all the conditions, like we went through, l'chayra, it should be okay with some sort of a liquid, obviously not regular toothpaste. And again, it's something whereby one should double check, make sure it has a good, as they say, hashkacha, or double check with their own rav and so on. Make sure if they do use something that's called a Shabbos toothbrush, that they're on the right track and they won't have any of these issues. Hatzlacha and bracha, kol tov. Thank you for listening, kol tov.